Welcome to this reading. This is Professor Smith, and I will be recording the book After Polygamy Was Made a Sin, The Social History of Christian Polygamy by John Cairncross. Polygamy was forbidden after Roman papists took over the church. Isaiah 4 tells us the Astra strongholds denying every believing woman a good husband will be overcome at the last. Enjoy, and may the Almighty Yahweh bless you. Okay, welcome, folks. We are back with another chapter. This one is titled Muslim and Christian Dogs. And so we're continuing on in this book. It has a lot of historical information, things that people in the churches are never exposed to. And the simple fact is that even the ecclesiastical hierarchy, that being the pastors and the priests of the churches, they haven't been exposed to it either. And so your nominal pastor in a church is not going to be familiar with the entire colorful history of Christianity, and in particular, this thread that has flowed all throughout. So when they make statements about what is acceptable regarding marriage, they are hampered by a very parochial, narrow view. And that's what we have to realize when we approach this thing, or when we try to open up discussions with such, the aforementioned. So it continues on. If Montesquieu was the first to exploit the picturesqueness of harem life, there were scores of others who followed gladly in his footsteps. The literature of the time returns again and again to the theme of male possessiveness. Thus, in the Gallantries de Therese by Brett, which appears in Amsterdam in 1745, there is an alluring scene in which the fair Therese agrees to become looks like mistress and titre. It's actually, it's translated, I think this is French. Maîtresse and titre of a rich but antiquated wooer. However, he insists that, quote, real love can never be associated with a little jealousy. Why, he goes on, are we not in Asia, where I would have the satisfaction of seeing you surrounded by the sacred guardians of women's virtue? You would be happy, and my security would be perfect. Wise Orientals, how prudent are your customs, and how much is it to be regretted that we have rejected such a secure and convenient means of procuring our inward peace of mind, unquote. In other words, readers note, he is opining on the lack of kind of safeguards that are in Western society, even at his in the year that he lived, those years. So essentially, he is sort of regarding Asian, which has harems. You know, rich men can have more than one woman. There's nobody even bats an eye at that over there. And then he contrasts that with the limitations of monogamy only found in the West, which we have seen in the historical narrative of Christian history, that it was the papacy. And they went even beyond than that. They went far beyond even that, even putting extra regulations in, extra rules in that weren't there in Scripture, to mandate celibacy in the priesthood. I mean, imagine, which, you know, a casual observer of the New Testament would say that that is written about, that it's a doctrine of demons written about by the apostles. Whereupon, for lack of a guard of eunuchs, he claps the chastity girdle on her. But in this case, at least, love laughed at locksmiths, for a charitable-minded member of that confraternity frustrated the jealous guardian's precautions when pressed by a nude and ardent young lover for assistance. But perhaps the wittiest attempt to use Oriental manners as cover for a skit on contemporary French manners is the Turkish memoirs, published by, it looks like, Barbier d'Ancourt in 1745 under the pseudonym of, quote, a Turkish author, member of all Mohammedan academies, Master of Arts, Doctor of Turkish Law at the University of Constantinople, unquote. It was a great success. It neatly reverses the usual ploy of male jealousy by satirizing the unofficial polyandry currently among certain French women. Reader's note, So essentially, what he's saying here is that the idea of that adultery was rampant among the educated classes in France. Biblically, this is adultery. A woman who sleeps with more than one man, that is not her husband. So this is the problem. So he basically contextualizes everything that way. The hero, Delhi, whose mother was French, falls in love with and marries Zulim, who, however, belongs to the sect of the Jatabists. One of the principles of this creed demands that a girl to enter paradise must first give herself to a priest of the sect, and thereafter never refuse any man. It is a religion which, says the author ironically, rates complacent husbands very high. When Delhi meets Zulim's sister and has an affair with her, Zulim, far from being distressed, is delighted. How happy am I, she cries. Dear Delhi, to see that you are beginning to believe in the great Jatab. No wonder it is in answer to my prayers that this miracle has happened. But he is less relieved when his wife goes on. I hope you will no longer regard it as a crime if I contribute to other men's happiness. I was not yet a Jacobus, he felt. I was still only a Frenchman. Delhi takes his wife to France on a mission. Reader's note here. Basically, some of this is getting into the bizarre, um, and it's an exploration of the other end of the spectrum where you have this polyandry, this kind of polyandry going on, which is a married woman having sexual relations with more than one man. She has her husband, but then she has other men. Okay, so Delhi takes his wife to France on a mission which gives rise to facile satirical digs. Zulim is surprised at the liberty enjoyed by the wives. I see on all sides that we women are a kind of divinity here. Not only men are slaves. Can it be, she asks naively, that a French woman have a number of them in their harems? She is, of course, soon surrounded by a host of admirers and cannot understand her husband's concern lest she should form an attachment with one or several of them. But what am I depriving you of? She exclaims. Shall I be any of the less yours when you desire me? And she insists on the danger of damnation, which she is running by withholding her favors. You know the threats of the great Jatab. If I refuse, I will forever be deprived of the happiness of these women who are faithful to this law. And she appeals to him not to force her to appear devoid of religion. The situation is saved only thanks to the ingenious stratagem of a pious French woman who tells Zelim that she is forbidden to belong to any man so long as she is in France. The book also, for good measure, exploits the well-worn theme of polygamy as a superior mode of life. One passage praises the insight of Mohammed, who, quote, could not imagine that the creator of all things had placed so many imperious pleasures in man's hearts for the sole purpose of making man combat them, unquote. And it also seeks following the Persian letters to justify the harem as offering a haven to women. The custom of buying a slave appears barbarous only to the ignorant. It is, quote, it is an honor for the woman of Asia to enter our seraglios, says Delhi. Quote, the fairest are destined to them from childhood, and their first lesson at their mother's knee is how to behave when they get there. There are few things from which nature shrinks. We can adjust to anything. Once she has joined a harem, a woman, we are assured, enjoys its safety and calm. Attalide, one of Delhi's wives, a French girl, paints an alluring picture of the prevailing generosity of heart. She steers her husband into the arms of another of the inmates, confident that he will return to her with renewed ardor. She is jealous, she says, only of his heart. In France, she would never have imagined that such a life could be pleasant, but seen from within, the seraglio dispels her prejudices and appears to her as a place of delight. Life is free from cares and given up entirely to love. If Delhi, she writes, should find a French girl whom he wishes to bring back, he is at liberty to show her this letter in order to overcome her resistance, and if she does not come out, she, at a lead, will be delighted to have her as a friend. We are back at the instincting cooperation of the wives in Montaigne's cannibal utopia. So there was a lot there, but essentially it's discoursing this kind of, I would say it's very sexual morality is very loose here, especially in a polyandrous In other words, he is in some ways poking fun, but also highlighting the reality of the failure of a harem as conducted in Muslim society, or I think at first he was talking about Asian. This type of semi-serious apologia was, of course, fed by actual exchanges of wit between the two religions, as when Lacquetiere points out to his Muslim friends in Greece that a single wife is capable of infuriating the most reasonable husband in the world, and that they could not be keen on their peace of mind if they married four. The Turks were not at a loss for a reply. Quote, if four wives infuriated a husband, they were soundly enough punished for it by having only one husband among the four of them. Quote. In other words, readers note, the response, that which is often tritely offered to those who say, well, the scriptures allow a man to have more than one wife, even though society and the church has chosen to go a different road. Response is pretty good because basically what they're saying is the power of a woman, which is like an unfettered flame, is greatly covered and suppressed when there is competition in the household, you see. And this is the Turkish response. Continuing on, it was a popular gambit too, as Montesquieu's example illustrates, to suggest tongue-in-cheek that polygamy was making great progress among the European infidels. Since most men had an establishment of several women, even if it were an unofficial one, the Orientals were not slow to exploit this opening. Mohammed Effendi, a Turkish ambassador to France, quoted by the philosopher Hume in his essay on polygamy and divorce, made the most of this point. Quote, we Turks are great simpletons, he said. In comparison with the Christians, we are at the expense and trouble of keeping a seraglio, each in his own house. But you ease yourself of this burden and have your seraglio in your friends' houses. This is reader's note. So remember this title, seraglio. I believe this goes back to a man who is castrated. In other words, he cannot, he's had his it's been cut, and so he cannot produce children. So basically, what this does, this man, his sole job is to keep the women in order when the husband's away on business. Okay. But as so often, the wittiest skit on the subject is by Voltaire. It takes the form of an alleged exchange of letters between a Turkish vizier and an agent of the 15th century European potentate Charles V. And so Voltaire assures us, with his customary mock solemnity, quote, Christian dog, says the Turk, for whom, incidentally, I have a particularly high esteem, how can you reproach me for having four wives according to our holy laws, while you empty a dozen casks of wine a year, and I do not drink a single glass? What good do you do the world by spending a longer time at the table than I do in bed? It goes on, I can give four children a year to the service of our august master. You will hardly furnish one. Readers note here, notice the argument. The Turk, in comparing the typical morality of the churchian man at this time in Western civilization, is saying, look at how much I can provide for the concept of the state. If this man has four wives and they're all producing sons, that's a lot of young men that go into the military, isn't it? That's a powerful investment compared to what the Roman Church has mandated, that only that which comes from a monogamous union can produce. He goes on, anyway, what am I to do when two of my wives are in labor? Do I not need two others as my law commands? What becomes of you in the last month of your one wife's pregnancy and during her illnesses? Excuse me. You are forced to remain in a shameful idleness or to seek another wife. You are impaled on the dilemma of committing one or two mortal sins. I suppose that in our wars against the Christian dogs, we lose 100,000 men. This means that about 100,000 girls have to be provided for. It is not for the rich to take care of them. Is it not for the rich to take care of them? Woe to any Muslim so lukewarm as not to afford shelter to four girls as his lawful wives. I am modest in comparison to Solomon. You change your wines. Allow me to change wives. Oh, dog, let us live according to our country's custom. Come and have coffee with me, and then be off and caress your German wife, as you are reduced to her alone. Unquote. That's quite a scathing response to church morality, essentially. To which the Christian replies, let's see what the response is here. Quote, Muslim dog, for whom I have a profound veneration, before I finish my coffee, I will confute your arguments. Anyone with 4 wives has 4 harpies. They are 4 prisoners who, having never seen anything, never having anything to say to you, they know not one but you. As a result, you bore them. You are their absolute master, so they hate you. You are forced to have them guarded by a boar. He's referring to this eunuch, which is typically employed in in these Muslim harems. But Voltaire contributed not only the most amusing but also the fairest summing up of the whole issue. He started from entirely different criteria from Montesquieu, who he felt always exaggerated. It was, he contended, far more important to make existing men and women relatively happy than to achieve a superfluity of numbers, an approach well in advance of the time. He went on to ridicule the idea of the catastrophic decline in population propounded by the author of the Persian letters. Equally, China, Japan, and India, quote, the most populous countries in the world, showed that polygamy could not be regarded as always inimical to fecundity, and indeed could be useful and even necessary for an empire. He felt that marginally the interest of the state could be served by allowing a man with a sterile wife to have a second. On sexual grounds, the case was convincing for men. The East, he writes in another passage, has decided in favor of polygamy, and nature favors the Orientals. The time lost by pregnancies, confinements, and the natural indispositions to which women are subject seem to demand that this time be made up for. Reader's note. So essentially, his argument, he's far more glowing in his survey of the benefits in these various societies to the East. When he says, it's several different issues that he raises, such as the ability to produce children much quicker. It's much more compounded, and so on. And therefore, these children then, especially if they're young men, can be of use to the ruler in their army, and so on. Continuing on, back to Methuselah. Voltaire did not recommend the introduction of polygamy in Europe, but the virtuous Rousseau almost did. Nor is this attitude as surprising as it might seem. The iconoclast who toppled so many seemingly eternal idols had a conventional view of women, bathed in torrents of fearful sentiment. Far from favoring the revival of the sexual freedom typical of primitive peoples, like Diderot, his former friend, he preached a rustic severity of morals. His umbilical cord, uncut, was with the stern Calvinist Geneva of his birth, and he projected his views into the ideal future state. Any deviation from his canons was summarily condemned as degenerate, the fruit of the inequality and luxury rife in large cities. Rousseau's influence was prodigious. It is largely his doing if radicalism, both in France and abroad, has followed the, looks like, somber example of Sparta rather than the joyous hedonism of Tahiti. His Puritanism was buttressed by 2 other convictions, or perhaps it was simply reflected in them. One was a mechanistic view of society as a purely external force superimposed on the individual who represented the essence of things. This attitude comes out in his views on sex. He was certain that if a boy were brought up on Robinson Crusoe lines in the wilderness, away from the corrupting influences of civilization, he would die uncontaminated. Sex, it appears, came only from external solicitations. Readers know, hard to argue with that point, because if you have a young man that doesn't have anybody around, of course, what's he going to do? So in other words, he is, if you look at this contrast between nature and nurture, his argument relies heavily on the philosophical value of nurture. In other words, that which a young man is exposed to in society crafts him far more powerfully than any kind of innate predisposition, you see. Continuing on. A second constant in his thinking is his horror for women. He was afraid of the excessive sexual demands they might make on him. He was not at all keen on giving them the advantage of an education. Girls, he was convinced, needed nothing more than a little arithmetic for their household accounts and a rudimentary literacy, which did not go beyond Bishop Fenelon's pious and rustic utopia called Telemachus. A woman's only mission in life was to breed children and have her husband happy. Europe was declining because they were avoiding their duty. Soon the continent would become a desert in consequence. Even in the provinces, a woman with 4 or 5 children was regarded as fertile, he noted with horror. But the heart of the trouble lay in the cities, whose sinks of iniquity. Let me read that again. But the heart of the trouble lay in the cities, those sinks of iniquity. In London and Paris, there was hardly a decent woman left. He was in no doubt as to who should wear the trousers. Woman, he lays it down, also in his meal, is made to please and be subjugated. She must make herself agreeable to man. She must learn at an early age to suffer even injustice and bear the wrongs done her by her husband uncomplainingly. Share them with another woman, as in polygamy. In other words, he is pointing out, it's in brackets here, i.e., share him with another woman, as in polygamy. Okay. In other words, readers know his viewpoint is that he is suggesting the potential for polygamy, but it can only be done properly under the mantle of extreme patriarchy. After such blunt maxims, feminine claustration can hardly be far off. I would like, says Rousseau frankly, to see a young English girl cultivate her talents for pleasing her husband as careful as a young Albanian woman cultivates them in the harem of Ispahan. Shades of the Persian letters, Rousseau admittedly did not, like Montesquieu, go in for exotic eroticisms. But the two men were deeply concerned about the decline of population, and especially feminine morality, which they more or less equated. They were both afraid of feminine aggression and shared the conviction that women should live a secluded, not to say confined, existence and be submissive to their lord. And they both sought consolation in remembrance of things past, when life, they imagined, had been of exemplary purity. But if Rousseau was backward looking in many ways, he was also conventional, as his views on women show, and he stopped short of rejecting monogamy. But other writers of the period did not. The best known of these is perhaps Restif de la Brentone. Restif runs Casanova close in his score of female conquests. And some of his writings, such as The Good-Natured Libertine, were, at least until recently, printed only in limited editions or sold under the counter. But his amorous activities in no way prevented him from adopting an exceedingly moral tone. Like Rousseau and Montesquieu, he regarded urban life as a source of all evil and sheds copious tears on the corruption which they have exported to the countryside. In particular, he has an obsession with population, which makes the other two writers appear models of restraint. In Monsieur Nicolas, his autobiography, written in 1794 to 1797, he is unsparing in his denunciation of the willingness of French women of the age to have a large family. And in his good-natured libertine, he recounts with obvious delight the prowess of an individual who is siring children at an unprecedented rate in order to people a South Seas island with his progeny. Reader's note. So it appears here that he had this make-believe middle ground of what should be appropriate. And honestly, reminds me of some of the moralities, the morals that are common even within Methodism, being that I grew up in Methodism. The ideal is 2 children, nothing more. You have more than that, you're considered excessive. To have under that, you're considered not doing your duty, you see. This morality carries through even today, do you see? And so this is essentially what he is discoursing here. Continuing on, indeed, he goes even further and actually boasts in Monsieur Nicholas that in his innumerable adventures he has never tried to, quote, cheat nature, unquote. Unlike Casanova, whose considerate if unpatriotic policy was exactly the reverse. It is entirely in line with this philosophy of Restif's that, in his advice of Dom Beaugré to the French States General after the Revolution, he should denounce fellatio, contraceptives. We've got something here in French. Redingotis à l'anglaise. In other words, these are sexual acts which he wants to ban. He wants to denounce oral sex. He wants to denounce contraceptives. He wants to denounce a man pulling out early, like what Onan and did, and got them in big trouble with God. And coitus when the woman is pregnant. Now that's one that we have run across before. And now they've got this quote, F and populate is his war cry. I imagine if they're using a swear word there, but it's just a capital F dot 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 and populate is his war cry. That is the great aim of nature. Logically enough, therefore, he believes that men with pregnant wives should be allowed to take a concubine when the wife is 3 months gone and leave her when she too is pregnant in order to take another. The state would adopt the illegitimate children. Wow, look at that suggestion. Reader's note here, which would be completely contrary to scriptural. If you were to look at scripture from as the template for your morality, this would be considered violence against a woman. But he's presenting it in order to maintain the monogamy only charade. So he's saying that look, if you get your wife pregnant and she's 3 months along, being that he is maintaining these moralities of these things that are not allowed, including having relations with a wife who's pregnant, then he should be allowed to take another woman to take care of the husband's sexual needs. And that if she happens to have any children, she's just thrown out with the woman when his actual wife comes around and is able to relate with him in a sexual way again, which really, when you look at that, that's quite wicked. Just to round off the picture, it may be added that he makes a plea for incest to be allowed. He seems to have indulged in this forbidden pleasure copiously to judge from his writings, and that men should be permitted to repudiate their wives whenever they wanted. In this way, he argues it would be possible to wipe out incest, adultery, and cuckoldry. Restif did not advocate actual polygamy, but merely concubinage. An offbeat disciple of Rousseau's, Simon Linguet, did in his Memoirs on Civil Laws, published in 1767 and composed when he was only 30. He was one of those adventurous natures which pursued its turbulent path in old age, if they survive. Twice driven into exile for letting his corrosive and eloquent tongue, let me read that again, twice driven into exile for letting his corrosive and eloquent tongue run away with him, and imprisoned in the Bastille for a spell, on which he wrote lively but inaccurate memoirs. In other words, his mouth got him in big trouble. That's what it's saying here. But he was a very good speaker. The curse of being able to speak very well is that if you speak in a way that rulers deem corrupt, then they could put you in jail, and that's what happened to this guy. He was acclaimed as one of the leading barristers and publicists of his days. Now, he was an attorney. Look at that. Under the French Revolution, he boldly defended diminutive San Domingo's case against France and produced a spirited defense of Louis the 16th, the monarch deposed by the revolution. In 1794, he was arrested by the revolutionaries and shared his king's fate on the guillotine. His views are as adventurous as his career. Indeed, it would be easy to write him off as a crank. He defines bread as, quote, a highly dangerous invention, unquote, and compares himself with Harvey, who discovered the circulation of the blood, as a pioneer in human thought. He points out that in Asia, quote, where morals are still uncorrupted and governments honest, people eat only rice, and that the English and Dutch regard wheat as little better than poison. The plow paves the way for the decline of the species. Wheat spells depopulation, slavery, and bad health, unquote. Readers know here. So yeah, I mean, he comes off as a bit of a crank, admittedly. He has opinions on everything, which are probably, I don't think we could regard them as really educated opinions. They're just his deeply held feelings, and at the end, they got him in trouble. He ended up getting his head chopped off. In a man of such unconventional outlook, it is not surprising to find a plea for polygamy, which is unique in French literature practically up to modern times. Readers know here. Also know that when we're talking about France, we're talking about an extremely steadfast Catholic stranglehold. Okay? We're not talking about a country that gave birth or propagated Protestantism, which had somewhat of a looser morality. And remember that this was after the Council of Trent, where the Catholics basically looked the other way if a man took a concubine while his wife perhaps was pregnant or so on, or they just wanted another woman. They looked the other way, and they still considered him in good standing with the church. They gave him communion. This was the implication. But after Trent, they put the hammer down, and and all of that they recount is because of what Luther dared to do in supporting Prince Philip of Hesse, his contention he wanted to take a second wife because his first was barren. So, continuing on here, let me see here. True, there had been at least a couple semi-serious works of the type of the Persian letters in which the erotic protagonists were Jews instead of the Turks or Siamese, but they can hardly be classified as serious contributions to moral science or practice. The Marquis de Argens, for example, had composed his Jewish letters, 1738 to 42, in which the former rabbi of Istanbul denounces the evils of monogamy, which to take only one instance, forces a sterile couple to stay together for life. He cannot understand why the multiplicity of wives practiced by the patriarchs should offend the deity. Monogamy is a custom which the Christians have taken over from the Romans. Among the Israelites of old, the plurality of wives was perfectly licit. In other words, readers know, allowed. David even, quote, chose a young wife in his last days, which were devoted to penitence, unquote. Looks like the Abbé Guéné, in his letters of some Portuguese Jews, 1769, makes much the same point, but dwells on the moral restraints which should accompany polygamy. No excessive intercourse, and in particular, none during pregnancies and periods. And of course, eunuchs and deaf mutes are anathema. Readers note here. Of course, the Bible says this one of no sex during pregnancies. Do you know that there is this is just a reader's note here, sort of my adding bits here from other experiences, but the Seventh-day Adventist, I think that's correct. The Seventh-day Adventists believe, and they actually encourage sex with a pregnant woman. They actually claim that it helps the pregnancy. Don't take my word for it. You can look it up yourself. But obviously, the Bible strictly condemns having relations with a woman during her period. If you look at this from strictly a biblical standpoint, strictly condemns it. In fact, it could get you cut off from the community. This is why people who study the Bible and who will conduct a morality that is from the template of the Bible do not have relations with their wife or wives while they are in their periods. But it's interesting here that he states that eunuchs and deaf mutes are anathema. Now, that's an interesting inclusion there, deaf mutes. I mean, what was his problem with deaf mutes? I mean, can they really help? I mean, does it really help their condition? Continuing on. Linguet, on the contrary, is in dead earnest, and his brief is taken in directly from Rousseau. That thinker had maintained that the emergence of individual property had led to inequality in which humanity is divided into rulers and slaves. Linguet agrees, but argues a century before Marx that with the emergence of rich and poor came polygamy. Women, like most men, were degraded to the level of goods and chattels. It was therefore forbidden to dispose of them other than with the consent of the owner, the parents. Hence, several severe penalties were introduced for women having children outside marriage. And Linguet quotes the case of Abraham, who, having loaded Rebekah's parents with gifts, is immediately told, "Take her away with you." She is, in fact, no more than a piece of merchandise. Thus, from the start, the two pillars of civilization were, on the one hand, the enslavement of the greater part of men, and on the other, that of all women. It follows that, since women were marketable assets, a man could have as many as he could afford. The rich, therefore, usually acquired a goodly number of wives, whereas the rest had to make do with one. But Linguet does not condemn woman's subjection any more than he condemns the slavery that also flowed from the creation of property. On the contrary, he ardently defends plural marriage, at least in the Old Testament form. For him, as for Gwynne, there was no element of constraint under the patriarchal system. Women regarded their sole function as the production of children and did not seek intercourse once they were pregnant. And they all collaborated joyfully in looking after their husband's wants. Such an understanding attitude made it easier for the man to discharge their marital duties. But in any case, in these happy days of yore, exercise and sustained frugality made a man's vigor eternal. So in other words, he's saying that because of the restrictions of monogamy, men have to develop a self-control that is beyond what is typical in the history or beyond what is accepted in other cultures, which allow plural marriage. A frugal existence prolonged his youth almost till decrepitude. Husbands, therefore, always retained power and authority over their wives and were able to fecundate them, in other words, impregnate them. But these days are no more. Luxury and vice have pervaded the modern world, and men and women are at one only in seeking pleasures, of which the least that can be said of them is that they are sterile. Linguet is even carried away so far by his love of the patriarchal that he ends up, like Montesquieu, by defending Asian customs. There he writes, polygamy has become a fundamental habit regardless of the climate and numbers of men and women, like the turban and the flowing robe. And so he rejoins the long line of those such as John of Leyden, Ochino, and Lyser, who demanded the revival of polygamy. To his thesis, he brings to bear all the force of his rhetorical talents. If, he argues, custom has induced women to immolate themselves of their own free will on a husband's course, let me read that again. He says, if, he argues, custom has induced women to immolate themselves of their own free will on a husband's corpse, as in India, would it be impossible to persuade them to tolerate without bitterness the sharing of a living husband? Unquote. Let me reader's note here. Of course, this was a horrific thing that the British stopped. But in pagan India, yes, that's true. That if a husband died, his wife that was left over would set herself on fire and die with him of her own free will. Or if it wasn't of her free will, if she decided she didn't want to kill herself, the elders would make sure she died. In the same manner. It was quite a barbarous practice. When the British came upon it, they stopped it. With glad tidings, I'm sure, among the majority, especially the women of the population. But it's interesting here that if it so be, and this goes back to the nature versus nurture philosophical controversy. In other words, he is saying that you can create a community and the nurture is strong enough that you could get women to get rid of these foolish notions that Romanism and Greco morality has instilled so deeply with them that has elevated them to the pedestal of being the only wife. You see, you can get rid of those things if you have the right constraints, the right nurture in place, you see. And so he goes on, he says, women are easy to influence. And this is one of the reasons I kind of go on rabbit trails here, but this is one of the reasons I have to, as the reader, I have to agree with him. I tend to fall into the nurture side of the philosophical debate. Okay. Personally, this is just Brother Smith saying this. And women are easy to convince. And if I can opine but a minute on the fact that we have women in government, in the uh, Senate and in the Congress, and look at what has happened as a result by allowing the floodgates for women to come in. Uh, Now you've got women who are putting into law they can murder their babies. They're even trying to get them murdered after they're born. Okay. Now you've got LGBTQ, total degeneration of society. Look at the churches in this recent controversy, where the Southern Baptists said, nope, we're not going to allow women to get into the pastoral role. We're not going to do it. But look at all the other, most of these other denominations. At first, it's allowing women into a role that she was not innately designed for, according to God's word. Then comes the perversion. You allow one perversion, now the next perversion is on its way. So you've got women into authority, then you've got the murder of their children, then you've got LGBTQ. Okay, this is Brother Smith sort of commenting on what is quite a heady subject here, but I think it's something that we need to pay attention to. Quote, let public opinion therefore convince them that they are not intended to be alone in enjoying a husband, and you will see them suffer in peace the competition of a number of rivals. The plurality of wives is not revolting and may be useful, unquote. However, he qualifies his case by a very far-reaching reservation. If people are really moral, let there be no fear of polygamy becoming dangerous as long as it is confined within proper limits. It has only been useful to mankind. It has only been useful to mankind, he states. If, since then, it has been deemed fit to abolish it, this is not because it is prejudicial in itself. It is doubtless because our state of corruption could not have borne a state of affairs which calls for moral simplicity, from which we are far removed. However, plural marriage would cause more abuses among us than it did good among our ancestors, unquote. So this, I think he's on to something here. Here's the deal. If the practice of having more than one wife were allowed into the congregation, it would have to be extremely and rigidly controlled. And the inevitable bane of most of these communities throughout history, I speak of the Munsterites, is the elders did not control it sufficiently to allow it to be of use. You see. And in similar fashion, it can be like a fire that gets out of control, you see. So this is something to consider as well. This last reservation, which is note of realism, is revealing. Linguet foreshadows modern thought in its attempts to relate institutions to the social fabric and structure in a dynamic, revolutionary perspective, which points forward to the 19th century. He not only had a brilliant intuition that polygamy reflected the social and economic inequalities of a certain stage of development, but suspected that it would be useless to try and insert patriarchal marriage in an urban setting where the pastoral regime of the Old Testament was a remote, if venerated, memory. Yet Linguet's patriarchal attitude to women is much the same as his master's in the, quote, harem, unquote, passage already quoted. Rousseau stopped short at monogamy, whereas Linguet went one step further and urged polygamy. But for both, as for the Munsterites, before and after the introduction of plural marriage, the role of woman was to breed children, live in seclusion, and see her lord and master's needs. Reader's note here, I should correct myself. It wasn't the Hutterites, it was the Munsterites. Okay. I get those two confused sometimes. But it's what I spoke before on the society that allowed the practice sort of came unraveled because there was a lack of extreme control. That was the Munsterites. Okay. Now we have a title called Napoleon, one white and one black and two khaki. And it goes on here. Napoleon would have disagreed on many counts with Linguet, for example, as regards love, which the great general defined as tomfoolery for two. Quote unquote. That's an interesting attitude, isn't it? but he would have heartily subscribed to his ideas on the overriding importance of producing children, and he too favored polygamy. Isn't that something that Napoleon Bonaparte favored polygamy? Las Casas, the historian who accompanied Napoleon into exile on the Isle of St. Helena, records two pronouncements by the great man, both in 1816, that is, at the beginning of his seclusion. The first declaration was delivered in a playful tone on the 3rd of June, but there is little doubt that it represents Napoleon's real conviction. And here's the quote. Quote, "We Western people do not understand anything about women. We have treated them too well and made them almost our equals. The Eastern peoples have a much more sense and feeling of what is the right approach. They have declared them the property of man, and indeed nature has made them to be our slaves. It is only because of our own silly ideas that they claim to be our sovereigns." Unquote. Napoleon went on to express strong approval of polygamy, asserting that it was natural. Woman's function is to have children, but a single woman is not enough to secure that objective. And he quotes the standard proof. Women's indispositions and limitations. Quote, "She stops being a wife when she can no longer give her husband children. Man, whom nature impedes neither by age or nor by any of these disadvantages, must have several wives," unquote. And he concludes by emphasizing the difference in gravity between male and female adultery, and in underlining women's dependence on man. Quote. Reader's note here. Remember that when Napoleon makes these comments, and he includes the weight between a man's adultery and a woman's adultery, remember that this was after the Council of Trent, and the Trent had declared that if a man who is married to one wife, if he has sexual relations with an available single woman, they falsely call that adultery. So you have to understand in context of that when looking and analyzing Napoleon Bonaparte's comments. Before the Council of Trent, and for many times it was considered considered something like licentiousness, or if a married man had relations with an available single woman, it would be considered like concubinage, or it would be considered something far less severe than adultery. But he seems to indicate, at least has an understanding, that there is two very different things, and the nexus of it all is that there is no equality in terms of the sexes. In other words, the seriousness, so on. Continues here. And a few months later, on the 23rd of September, he pronounced his major apology of polygamy. He started off by emphasizing the difference in practice between East and West as regard women's freedom. Everything is arranged among the Orientals so that they can guard their wives well and be sure of them. Our whole life in the West, on the contrary, is such that we cannot guard them, and we are obliged to rely on them. We have to depend on the woman's sense of honor and to have blind confidence in them. Napoleon goes on to assert that it never occurred to him to keep a personal watch on women because, quote, "the torment of precautions is greater than the danger one seeks to avoid. It is better to abandon oneself to one's destiny," unquote. In striking such a philosophic poise, Napoleon was extremely disingenuous. Now, let me make a quote. Let me make a comment here because this is interesting to consider as well. Essentially, what he's saying is the trouble of it, and what would be the kickback from his wife of basically, say, like having a person who was, say, like a man who was, his genitals were marred so that he could not have, this kind of a guy watching over the women. That, in other words, if you had that kind of system in place, then he could rest more surely in the honesty and morality of his wife because she was looked after. Because left to their own devices, the implication is they go awry. They go awry. Okay. But at the end of it all, he says the trouble of it is too much, and so I just have to blindly trust her. And but also remember that Napoleon dealt with his wife's infidelity many times. So this also formed his opinion. okay, on this. And she did so in a very sly way many times. Sometimes it finally came out, it became so public. Um, there was no way around it. But if you study the life of Napoleon Bonaparte, you'll see that his wife was philandered around, you know. All right. At least that was the implication in the movie they did of him. I haven't actually read a whole book on the life of Napoleon Bonaparte, except for in historical books where it covers Napoleon Bonaparte. But they made a big deal of that in the movie, I think. Let's see here. We're almost to the end here. In striking such a philosophic poise, or pose, I think that's pose, Napoleon was being extremely disingenuous. Once he knew that Josephine, his first wife, had been deceiving him, he had a perpetual watch kept on her. So Josephine was the woman who was stepping out on her husband, Napoleon Bonaparte, okay? Day and night, she was never left alone with a man, and Josephine was sterile. His precautions with Marie Louise, the Empress, who was not uh, were, as many critics have observed, positively Oriental. After insisting that women are just as happy in the East as in the West, Napoleon vouchsafes his explanations of polygamy among the Orientals. It is not because there are more women than men or because men in the East are better equipped than the West. The real reason is simple. All the Western peoples have roughly the same appearance and color. It is thus possible to align them only one mate. Quote, happy, admirable, and beneficent law, which raises the status of women and procures for both sexes torrents of moral joy, unquote. With the Eastern peoples, the situation is quite otherwise. They differ among themselves as widely as day and night. They are white, black, copper colored, and mixed. The main point, therefore, is the establishment of a blood brotherhood between them, in the absence of which they will perpetually exterminate, prosecute, or oppress each other. And the only way of securing this objective is by polygamy. This gives them a possibility of having at the same time a white wife, a black one, a mulatto one, and a copper colored one. From then on, the different colors form part of one and the same family and are merged in the affection felt for them by the head of the family. He goes on, and it continues. Here's his quote. Mahomet seems to have known the secret and to have acted accordingly. Otherwise, how would a man who follows so closely in the steps of Christianity and swerved so little from it not have suppressed polygamy? Can it be said that he kept it because his religion was utterly sensual? But then he would have allowed the Muslims an indefinite number of wives and not restricted them to four, which would imply one white, one black, one copper colored one, and one mixed, unquote. Now, notice where it says it uses, this is the old term for Mohammed. It's just a different transliteration, Mahomet. We're talking about Mohammed, the founder of Islam. Napoleon adds that he realizes that 11 out of 12 Muslims have only one wife. But the fact that polygamy is professed by the leaders and thus blends race and color in the upper classes establishes general union and equality. And Napoleon concludes that even if polygamy were not based on political calculation, its effects has been just as brilliant. So much for the statesman's theories. What of his practice? Las Casas, fortunately, satisfies our curiosity in the same passage on this score as well. Napoleon, it appears, seriously thought of introducing polygamy in the West Indies. These islands badly needed a Negro labor for the sugar plantations, but had difficulty in procuring it. The emperor felt that the solution might lie in polygamy, which, it is not clear how, might reconcile the Negroes to their drudgery in the plantations. He even went to the length of consulting Catholic theologians on the possibility of modifying the church's doctrine on this point, in view of the special circumstances, unquote. Las Casas does not relate the outcome of this démarche, but it is clear that nothing came of it. Well, readers note, of course nothing came of it, because the Catholic Church was immovable in its denunciation of what Scripture allows, that a man may have more than one wife. It's clear if you read it from a literal standpoint. But the Catholic Church didn't like it, and they went even further. They said it must be celibacy and priesthood as well, you see. So these attempts, even at so this also gives you an idea how powerful the papacy was, because when you think of Napoleon, you think of the pinnacle of civil power at the time. Of course, this was before, presumably, this was before his disastrous defeats. But civil power couldn't even stand in the face of the papal power, you see. And that's interesting because I never really knew this about Napoleon Bonaparte, this particular aspect, but he was really pushing, at least among the Negroes, he said, but I think secretly he probably wanted it uh, allowed in other areas too. Continues on. If Napoleon felt that concessions might be needed across the Atlantic and France itself, he insisted on rigid monogamy. Well, of course, he probably did that because he knew that would be a bridge too far. I mean, I'm okay. That might be an assumption on the reader's part, but for him to go this far and say, well, the Africans can have it, and then you have a man who was repeatedly cheated on by his one wife. This is, a problematic proposition to claim that he really did truly believe this, but he was fearful of the papacy. It's more likely, in my opinion. In 1807, the Jewish authorities in the country accepted as one of the measures securing their assimilation the abolition of polygamy. Look at that. Look at that. There is a historical note there. 1807, that tells you that the Jewish authorities who were keeping the Torah as best they could in the dispersion were practicing polygamy. As far, and of course, the rabbis lie about this stuff all the time and try to pin them down and get them to admit how prevalent it was. They will lie. Well, a lot of people sometimes just lie out of fear, and that's essentially what it is. They don't want to admit the reality of a situation, but here is another source which confirms it. So as part of securing their assimilation, they had to get rid of polygamy, which had until then been at least tolerated by the community's members. Very interesting. That Napoleon should have had a weakness for polygamy and held strict views on women's role is not surprising. He was born in Corsica, that is, in an island where the current ethos was not so different from that of the rest of the Mediterranean, and indeed of the Arabs on its southern shores. He would clearly have regarded life as being greatly simplified if women were claustrated. In other respects, his attitude was also oriental. Thus, he took Josephine back, even after she had been unfaithful to him. For him, she had merely followed her natural feminine tendency. In such cases, either a man still loved the woman and he forgave her, or he did not and repudiated her. A similar attitude is reflected in the Code of Napoleon, published in 1804, and in the Criminal Code of 1810. In the former document, the emperor intervened personally only on the question of the family and in a thoroughly retrograde sense. In this case, his views on women converge with his political ideas to place her in a state of complete subordination to the husband. His main preoccupation was with the consecration and sanctity of the rights of property. Hence, the only provision in the code as regards marriage relate to the marriage contract. Under these provisions, the husband can administer his wife's property and usually dispose of it. Readers note, that's also actually technically what the Bible says. That's one of the reasons why what's her name in I'm trying to remember, it's an apocryphal book. Judith, there it is. The apocryphal book Judith, one of the reasons why she didn't remarry because she knew the Torah law, which said that her new husband would take control of her property, which had been left her by her husband, because they had no children. Continuing on. Let's see here. Let's read this again. Under these provisions, the husband can administer his wife's property and usually dispose of it. He can also dispose of her earnings. He can sue for divorce on the grounds of her adultery, whereas she can only do so if he keeps a concubine in the same house. Look at that one. So even as late as the 1800s, we're talking here, a man could conceivably have his wife and then have a concubine on the side, but he just had to keep her outside the house walls where the wife dwelt. You see? It was acceptable, but if he tried to move her into the house, he got in big trouble. Torrents of moral joy indeed. The Penal Code makes even more dismaying reading. Adultery, which had been abolished as a crime in 1791, is punishable by a fine in the case of a husband, which he can often pay for out of the wife's property. Imagine that one. Whereas a minimum of 2 years imprisonment attached to the crime if committed by the wife. Well, they were quite light on women adulterers, weren't they, at the time? Just 2 years. It restores the delete d'honneur, i.e., a husband is acquitted if he kills his wife's lover in flagrante. That's in brackets. It forbids any attempt to determine the father of an illegitimate child, and hence is a direct encouragement to seducers. As late as 1897, a Swiss legist termed the French penal code the most unfair to women in all Europe. In short, both codes, like certain aspects of Napoleon's policy generally, undid the conquest of the French Revolution. Indeed, in some ways, they are even more severe than the ancient regime. In other words, I think this is a Latin ancient regime, perhaps. I think it could be Latin. I'll have to look it up. But in other words, what he's saying is that way long ago, things were much more strict, but things tended to unravel uh, in terms of morality with time, with the passage of time. Just how backward his approach to marriage was may best be seen by a comparison with the other extreme, a writer inspired by the French Enlightenment, whose ideas even today appear so radical as to be impractical. And it looks like impracticable. I wonder why would they put it. You could just as easily put impractical. And who is therefore dealt with in a later chapter. Okay, so that concludes this chapter. Now, chapter 5, 6, 7, 8. So chapter 8, when nature prompted. And I'm going to try to get around to that as soon as I can. There was a lot of, I love this stuff about Napoleon. I got to tell you, I love this stuff. I never knew this stuff. I knew a lot about Napoleon and his wars and so on because we studied that in classes long ago, and I've continued to read historical works and so on. But they never touch his views on polygamy. Isn't that something? It is like a subject that is off limits, and yet it seems to be such a significant part of the life of Napoleon Bonaparte, doesn't it? And so, with that, my friends, I hope you guys enjoyed this. Put some comments down there. I've had some naysayers put some stuff down there. That's fine too. I try to handle them as graciously as I can. But hey, we need to know this stuff. The church needs to know this history. They need to know that their narrow parochial view of churchianity is not necessarily the truth. And what we need to do is people who can balance freedom with restraint. That's what we need to do. We need to balance freedom with restraint. Then we can be the most successful in our lives, can't we? And so with that, Professor Smith bids you farewell.